The Millionaire's quadruplets ran to the Maid, and what they said left their father in shock. Alexander Morozov once believed that he had reached the peak of his life. At 38, he owned a large real estate conglomerate, projects spread across multiple cities, contracts worth millions of dollars, and a long list of connections that commanded respect from others. His villa was located in a quiet suburban area, isolated from the noise of the city. The house was vast, 3 stories high, with a glass winter garden, marble-tiled hallways, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking snow-covered trees. It had once been a place filled with laughter, running footsteps, and children calling out to one another. But now the house was left with only silence. Not the pleasant quiet of rest, but a heavy, cold silence that clung to every wall, every staircase, every empty room. Alexander could walk from one end of the villa to the other without hearing any sound except his own footsteps. His 4 sons, Leo, Mark, Daniel, and Noah, lived on the 2nd floor, in a room that had once been designed to overflow with color. Small beds were placed side by side, shelves filled with toy cars, wooden blocks, and stuffed animals. But everything now seemed like mere decoration. The children sat for hours on the bed or on the floor, their eyes unfocused, staring into empty space. They did not argue, did not laugh, did not cry. They did not ask questions. They did not demand anything. It was as if emotion had been drained from their small bodies. Alexander often stood silently at the doorway, looking at the 4 small backs turned toward him. He wanted to step inside, to hold them, to say something that would pull them back into this world. But every time he stopped, not because he did not love his children, but because he did not know what to do. He could manage hundreds of employees, handle the most intense negotiations, build skyscrapers that reached the sky. But in front of those 4 silent children, he was completely helpless. This house had everything that money could buy. It lacked only one thing: life. Alexander still remembered very clearly the day Elena told him that she was pregnant. They were sitting in the kitchen on an autumn morning, sunlight streaming through the window. Elena placed the ultrasound results on the table, her hands trembling, her eyes both smiling and crying. When the doctor announced that it was not 1, not 2, but 4 children, Alexander laughed in shock, while Elena covered her face and burst into tears. She was afraid, but within that fear, there was joy, there was hope, there was love. The months of pregnancy were a series of exhausting challenges. Elena had to remain almost completely on bed rest. Back pain, sleepless nights, moments of panic when thinking about the future. But she endured everything, for the children, for the family. On the day the 4 children were born, the surgery lasted nearly 3 hours. Alexander remembered the feeling of holding each son in his arms, one by one. Small bodies, warm, fragile, yet full of life. He remembered Elena's eyes as she looked at the children for the first time, exhausted but shining. At that moment, Alexander believed they were a family nothing could break. The first 2 years were truly difficult, but they were also the happiest time. Nighttime crying, endless diaper changes, mornings of complete exhaustion. Elena hardly left the children's side for even a moment. She refused most help from nannies, saying she wanted to do everything herself. She wanted to be there in every single moment. But when the children entered their 3rd year, Alexander began to notice very small changes. Elena was more tired. She became easily irritated. She often closed her bedroom door, saying she had a headache. The hugs grew fewer. The bedtime stories disappeared. Elena no longer came downstairs for breakfast with the family. Alexander reassured himself that it was just exhaustion. Who wouldn't be tired taking care of 4 children? He suggested hiring more help, suggested taking a vacation, suggested everything he could think of. Elena refused all of it. Then one winter morning, when gray light covered the cold bedroom, Alexander woke up to see Elena packing a suitcase. She folded her clothes slowly, precisely, without haste, without trembling. "What are you doing?" Alexander asked, his voice hoarse with a sense of dread. Elena did not look at him. She only said very softly, "I can't continue anymore." Alexander stood up, his heart pounding. "Continue what?" Elena turned to look at him for the first time. In her eyes there was no anger, no pain, only emptiness. "I feel nothing when I look at the children. No love, no attachment, just emptiness." The words were like a bloodless knife. Alexander tried to take her hand, talked about doctors, about postpartum depression, about how they could seek help. Elena pulled her hand away. "It's not an illness," she said. "It's me. I don't want to be a mother." She pulled the suitcase toward the door. She did not look back. She did not cry. She made no promises. She left behind nothing but a house full of small children and a man frozen in place. That evening, Leo asked, "Where is Mom?" Alexander said, "Mom went away for a while." The next day, the question was asked again. Then, a few weeks later, the question stopped. The children no longer asked. They fell silent. And that silence seeped into the house, into Alexander's heart, becoming a wound that did not bleed, but never healed. After Elena left, Alexander entered the longest year of his life. Not because time moved slowly, but because every day was cruelly the same. In the morning, he woke up in an empty bedroom. In the evening, he closed the door on 4 silent children. There were no more questions of, "Where is Mom?" No more cries asking to be held. Only eyes that looked straight through him, as if he did not exist. Alexander began searching for help in desperation. He invited the best pediatricians. They checked every health indicator and said the children were completely normal physically. He invited child psychologists who brought books, therapeutic toys, emotional exercises. They came 3 times a week, patiently sitting on the floor for hours, talking, asking questions. The 4 boys did not respond. They did not answer. They did not resist. They did not cry. They were simply silent. Alexander hired nannies. The first one lasted a month. When she left, she said through tears that she had never worked with children who could not see the person in front of them. The second was an older woman with extensive experience, but she stayed only 3 weeks. She admitted that she felt powerless, as if she were caring for shadows. Those who came afterward left even faster. The reasons varied, but the essence was the same. The children could not be reached. The house gradually became a lifeless place. The rooms were always clean and orderly, but there were no signs of life. Toys remained untouched in their boxes. The children's drawings on the walls looked as if they belonged to another family, not this one. Alexander changed as well. He began missing meetings, forgot to reply to emails. Went to the office only to sit and stare at the screen without knowing what he was looking at. Major projects fell behind schedule. Partners complained. The reputation he had built over 15 years began to crack. He gained weight from mindless eating, then lost weight from forgetting to eat. He no longer met friends. Phone calls grew fewer, then disappeared. His life shrank, revolving only around the villa, the office, and the children's room on the 2nd floor. Some nights, Alexander sat on the hallway floor, leaning against the wall, listening to the silence behind the closed door. He wondered if he had done something wrong, whether he had missed any signs, whether there was some way he could have made Elena stay. But the questions had no answers. A year passed like that. No progress, no hope. Only a successful man, owning everything others dreamed of, completely defeated by the pain of 4 children. That woman appeared on a morning in early January when snow still covered the garden in front of the villa. Alexander was not expecting anyone. His mother only came on weekends. Friends had long since stopped visiting. The sound of the doorbell made him flinch slightly. When he opened the door, he saw a woman standing there. She was in her early 30s, wearing an old dark-colored coat, a simple wool scarf wrapped around her neck. In her hand was a cloth bag containing cleaning supplies. Her face was unremarkable, but her eyes were strangely calm. "Hello, sir," she said softly. "My name is Clara. An acquaintance recommended me to help with the housework." It took Alexander a few seconds to remember. Someone who had worked in his house years earlier had mentioned a young woman looking for work. At the time, he had simply nodded, expecting nothing. Now, standing in front of Clara, he suddenly felt embarrassed when he thought about the state of the house behind him. "Please, come in," he said, his voice tired. Clara stepped inside, carefully wiping her shoes before placing her feet on the cold stone floor. She did not marvel at the spacious interior, did not appear curious. She only glanced around once, as if determining where she should begin. Alexander briefly explained the floors, the rooms, and the priority of the common living areas. Clara listened and nodded. She did not ask about the family. She did not ask about the children. She did not ask why such a large house was so empty. She simply rolled up her sleeves and began her work. The sound of the vacuum cleaner hummed steadily, then stopped. The sound of a mop touching the floor followed. Everything unfolded within the familiar silence of the house. Alexander returned to his study, trying to focus on the piles of paperwork on his desk. Then, in the middle of that stillness, he heard a very soft sound. Not a voice, not a noise, but singing. Clara was mopping the floor while quietly humming an old melody. The words were unclear, the origin unknown. It was just a slow, steady tune, like a lullaby worn down by time. Alexander stopped writing. He listened. The singing was not loud, but in a house accustomed to silence, it sounded strangely clear. It did not intrude. It did not show off. It was simply there. At first, Alexander thought he was imagining it. The soft singing drifted up from downstairs, then dissolved into the air like thin smoke. He continued sitting in his study, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his mind had wandered elsewhere. Part of him was afraid to stand up, afraid of breaking that fragile moment. On the second floor, in the children's room, Leo was the first to stop. The boy was sitting on the floor holding a wooden block, but not playing. When the singing slipped through the crack of the door, Leo tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something very familiar, very distant. Mark stopped moving a toy from one hand to the other. Daniel stopped staring at the wall. Noah blinked for the first time in months. The 4 children said nothing, but they listened. At the breakfast table, when Alexander called the children downstairs, everything happened as usual. Slow footsteps, neatly arranged seats, spoons lifted and set down in silence. He placed pancakes and honey in front of the children, forcing himself to smile. The singing sounded again from the living room. This time, Alexander saw the change. Leo stopped eating. He turned his head toward the door. Mark followed. Daniel and Noah lifted their heads almost at the same time. 4 spoons were placed on the table nearly simultaneously. No one said a word. Alexander held his breath. He was afraid that if he moved, the moment would disappear. The singing lasted a few minutes, then stopped. Clara had likely moved to another room. The children lowered their heads and continued eating. But something was different. Their eyes were no longer completely empty, as if a very thin, very delicate thread had just connected them to the outside world. After breakfast, Alexander let the children watch cartoons in the living room and stepped out to check on Clara. She was dusting, careful and focused. When she saw him, she stopped, slightly embarrassed. "Am I being too loud?" Clara asked softly. "I have a habit of singing while I work. If it's not appropriate—" "No," Alexander interrupted. "Not at all. Please, go on." Clara nodded, smiled faintly, and returned to her work. The singing rose again, steady, unintentional, not performed. Alexander went back to the living room. The 4 boys were no longer looking at the screen. They were looking toward Clara, just standing there, observing, not stepping closer, not retreating, as if they were trying to memorize her every movement. In the days that followed, small changes continued to appear. The children began showing up wherever Clara was working. If she was in the kitchen, they were coincidentally thirsty. If she was cleaning the living room, they sat on the chairs, pretending to watch television. Clara did not try to start conversations. She simply smiled when passing by, asked for permission when she needed to slip past where they were standing. And then, on the third day, something Alexander had not dared to dream of happened. Clara was preparing dough for an apple pie. The four boys stood around her, silent at first. Then small questions began to emerge. "What are you making?" "Is that cake sweet?" "Can we help?" Alexander stood in the hallway, gripping the wall to keep himself from collapsing. His children were talking, not because anyone forced them, not because of therapy, but because a woman was simply there. The initial changes happened quietly, but they were undeniable, and Alexander realized that he was not the only one who noticed them. The children began to wait for Clara. No one said it out loud. No child asked, "Is she coming today?" But every morning they woke up a little earlier, sat in the living room a little longer, their eyes frequently drifting toward the front door. When Clara walked in, the four boys did not run toward her. They simply let out a quiet breath of relief, as if they had just confirmed that something important was still there, that something in this life had not disappeared. Alexander observed everything in silence. He saw Leo standing close to the kitchen door when Clara cooked, saw Mark drag a chair closer to where she was cleaning the windows, saw Daniel and Noah sitting on the hallway floor, not playing with anything, just following her every step with their eyes. Clara remained the same. She did not change her behavior. She did not take advantage of the children's attention. She did not try to become the center of it all. She simply continued her work, smiling when she caught their eyes, saying, "Excuse me," when passing by, quietly asking whether they needed her to move out of the way. It was precisely that lack of demand that made the children feel safe. But for Alexander, along with the joy, a fear began to take shape. He knew exactly what would happen if Clara left. The four boys had already lost their mother once. A sudden disappearance, without explanation, without promises. If Clara disappeared as well, because of another job, because of her own life, for any reason at all, the second fall would be unbearable. Alexander began asking himself difficult questions. What right did he have to keep her there? She was only someone who came to clean the house. She had no obligation to stay because of his children. And if he did nothing, was he placing his children in danger once again? One afternoon, Clara did not come. No notice, no reason. Perhaps she was ill or had personal matters to attend to. But to the four boys, none of that mattered. Noah was the first to react. He stood by the door for an entire hour. Leo grew restless. Mark kept asking, "Has she come yet?" Daniel curled up on a chair, clutching his stuffed bear tightly. By evening, when Alexander said that Clara was not coming that day, Noah burst into tears. Not loud sobbing, but choked, frightened sobs. Alexander held his son in his arms, his heart tightening. "She'll come back," he said, even though he was not sure himself. "Tomorrow." That night, Alexander barely slept. He sat in his study, looking out at the dark garden, and for the first time in a long while, he understood that silence had left the house. But the price of life returning was the fear of loss. The next morning, Clara arrived earlier than usual. The four boys froze when they saw her. Then Noah ran forward, stopping halfway as if afraid he was doing something wrong. Clara bent down, smiled, and opened her arms. That was all it took. That afternoon, Alexander made a decision he had thought about all night. He invited Clara into his study and closed the door. His voice was low, slow, careful. "Clara," he said, "I want to propose something to you. Not as someone who hires you to clean the house, but as a father." Clara listened, her expression serious. Alexander took a deep breath. If you agree, I want you to stay here, live in this house, not for me, but for the 4 children." The room fell into silence, and Alexander understood that, from this moment on, nothing would be simple anymore. Clara moved into the villa quietly, just as she had entered their lives. She brought very few belongings, 2 old suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and a few small personal items. Alexander arranged a room for her on the 3rd floor with a window overlooking the winter garden. He thought the children would be happy, but he did not expect them to be this happy. The 4 boys followed Clara up to the 3rd floor, helping her carry things, asking questions non-stop, showing her the important places in the house. The sound of voices and laughter echoed on the staircase, making Alexander stand still in the entrance hall, feeling as if he were hearing the sounds of a life he had once lost. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life in the house changed with unbelievable speed. Clara made breakfast, took the children to school, picked them up, cooked dinner, read stories before bedtime. She did everything so naturally that no one called it a responsibility. It was simply continuous, steady presence, the very thing the 4 children needed most. And then, one evening, as Alexander stepped out of his study, he heard the children calling him from the living room. "Dad, come here for a moment." The 4 boys stood in a line. Their faces were strangely serious. Leo, as the eldest, took a deep breath before speaking. "We talked about it." Alexander paused. A vague instinct made his heart pound. "We think that—" Leo stopped, looked at his brothers, then continued, his voice soft but certain. "We want to call Clara Mom." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Alexander turned toward the kitchen. Clara was standing there, still holding the cleaning cloth, her face drained of color. She had heard everything. Her lips trembled, tears filling her eyes. Alexander knelt down in front of his children. "You already have a mother," he said slowly. "Your mother, Elena." "But Mom Elena left," Mark said calmly. "She didn't stay," Daniel added. "Clara stayed," Noah whispered. "Mom didn't leave." Clara broke down in tears. She stepped closer, knelt down with the children, her voice trembling. "I can't replace your mother. No one can replace your birth mother." Leo shook his head. "You're not replacing her. You're another mom." 4 small arms wrapped tightly around Clara. No forcing, no demanding. Just a very childlike, very simple choice. The one who stays is the mother. Alexander sat there, his heart breaking into pieces. He understood Clara's fear. He understood the enormous responsibility the 4 children had just placed on her shoulders. But he also understood something else. For the children, this was not an idea. This was survival. Clara looked up at Alexander, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she said softly. Alexander looked at his 4 sons clinging to her, and for the first time in more than a year, he no longer avoided the truth. "If not now," he said, "then maybe never." And from that moment on, Alexander knew that their family had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. After that evening, no one in the house mentioned the word mother again, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important. A careless word could shatter something that was still very fragile. Clara continued to care for the children as before. No changes, no demands to be called by any title. But Alexander noticed something else. The 4 boys clung to her more closely, as if, after saying those words, they were afraid that if they let go, Clara would disappear. Alexander could no longer ignore it. He spoke with his mother. He listened as she quietly recalled the days when the children still laughed and talked, then fell silent for a long time when he mentioned Clara. Finally, she said only one sentence. "You can't let the children lose another person." Alexander began to research the legal aspects, phone calls, meetings, difficult questions. Elena had officially relinquished her parental rights when she left. Legally, the 4 boys now had only one guardian. That opened a path, but also placed a responsibility on Clara that no one had the right to force upon her. Alexander spoke to her late one evening after the children had fallen asleep. They sat in the kitchen under the soft yellow light. Clara remained silent for a long time after he explained his intention. "I came here just to clean the house," she said quietly. "I never imagined I would become this." "I know," Alexander replied, "and if you say no, I will understand." Clara looked down at the cup of tea that had gone cold, then looked up. There was no panic left in her eyes, only deep thought. "If I accept," she said, "it won't be because of you, and it won't be because I want a family. It will be because those 4 children chose me." Alexander nodded. He had never heard a reason more right than that. The legal process lasted many months. Inspections, evaluations, questions for the children, and what silenced everyone present was the certainty in their answers. "We want to stay with Mom Clara." When the final papers were signed, there was no grand ceremony, no celebration, just a very ordinary evening in the familiar kitchen. The 4 boys wrapped their arms tightly around Clara. For the first time, no one stopped them from calling her Mom, and that family, imperfect, unconventional, was finally called by its true name. After everything had been named properly, the house entered a rare period of calm. No more meetings with lawyers. No more lengthy evaluations. No more fear that someone might disappear tomorrow. Life became ordinary. Clara took the children to school every morning. Alexander took them for walks on the weekends. Dinners took place around the old wooden table where the 4 boys competed to tell stories about their day. Small, unimportant stories, but full of life. It was within that ordinariness that Alexander began to realize something. He no longer looked at Clara as a housekeeper, not only as the mother of his children. He looked at her as a woman, a calm, steadfast woman, capable of staying when things became the most difficult. He noticed it in very small details. The way Clara left a cup of coffee on his desk when she knew he would be up late. The way she lowered her voice when she saw he was tired. The way she never interfered in his relationship with the children, yet was always there, close enough. Alexander began to fear his own thoughts. He was the one who employed her. He was the father of the children she had just accepted as her own. Any feeling that crossed the boundary could ruin everything. So he stayed silent. But feelings do not disappear just because they are left unnamed. Clara sensed the change as well. She caught Alexander's gaze lingering a moment longer, noticed the slight hesitation in his voice, but she, too, remained silent. She was far too used to putting others before herself. Until one evening, when the children were asleep, they sat together in the kitchen as they had many times before. No one spoke for the first few minutes. This silence was not heavy, but hesitant. "Clara," Alexander said, calling her by name for the first time without any distance. "I need to say this. Not so you have to answer. I just don't want to hide it anymore." Clara looked up. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've fallen in love with you. But if that makes you uncomfortable, I will step back. This family matters more than anything." Clara did not answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then smiled very faintly. "I feel the same," she said, "but I'm afraid of making things complicated." Alexander shook his head. "We've already been through the most complicated things." And in that quiet kitchen there were no rushed promises, only a gentle acknowledgement, love that comes after healing, and therefore moves slowly enough not to hurt anyone. Spring came very slowly that year. The snow gradually melted in the winter garden, revealing young green shoots pushing up through the cold ground. Alexander stood by the glass window, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, quietly watching the 4 boys run around the yard, laughing loudly, competing to tell stories with no beginning or end. Clara stood nearby, her arms folded across her chest, her gentle gaze following the children's every step. They called out to her without thinking, without hesitation. They called her as if she had always been there. Alexander realized that he was no longer standing outside this life. He was not just watching it, he was inside it. In the evenings, they sat down to eat together. The dining table was not perfect. Sometimes it was noisy, sometimes chaotic. There were childish arguments, tired sighs. But no one was silent anymore. No one disappeared. This family was not built from ideal beginnings. It had been patched together from cracks, from losses, from moments when standing back up seemed impossible. But precisely because of that, it was stronger than any perfect model. Alexander looked at Clara, then at his 4 sons. He understood that there were things in life that could not be bought, could not be forced, and could not be planned. They only came when someone was patient enough to stay. For those children, Clara was not the one who gave birth to them, but she was the one who chose to stay. And sometimes in this life, staying is the greatest form of love. 3 years passed since the day the house found its warmth again. The 4 boys were now bigger, taller, louder. Their laughter no longer sounded restrained. Then one early autumn afternoon, when the leaves outside began to turn yellow, the woman who had given birth to the 4 children returned. Elena stood in front of the iron gate, thinner, older, her eyes no longer cold as they had been 3 years earlier, but filled with confusion and regret. She said she had lost everything, that the past years had been empty years, that only now did she understand what she had lost. Alexander listened in silence. Clara stood beside him, and the 4 children stood a few steps away. None of them ran forward. None of them hid. Leo was the one who stepped ahead. His voice did not tremble, but it was very slow. "We're not angry with you, Mom." Elena burst into tears. "But we can't go back to how things were before," Mark continued. "Because before, you left," Daniel said softly. "And now, we already have a mom," Noah whispered. They looked toward Clara, their mom, Elena, the woman who had stayed when everything fell apart, the woman who made no promises but never left. Elena knelt down. She asked for forgiveness, and the 4 children forgave her, without resentment, without bitterness. They forgave like children who had been loved enough. But they did not follow her, not because of hatred, but because they were no longer lost. When Elena left for the 2nd time, the sky did not collapse. No one fell silent. No one froze. The 4 children returned to the dining table, where Clara was preparing dinner. "I'm hungry, Mom Elena," Leo said. Clara smiled.